It's Donald versus Donald, the president of the European Council, letting loose on trade tariffs and the Iran nuclear deal ahead of an EU leaders' dinner in the Bulgarian capital on Wednesday.
It's like that who needs enemies. But frankly speaking, Europe should be grateful by President Trump, because thanks to him, we have got rid of all illusions. He has made us realize that if you need a helping hand, you will find one at the end of your arm.
Fighting words, but how do they help those trying, for instance, to salvage the Iran deal? Already, French giant Total warns its new mega gas project with the Iranians is in jeopardy. What response when the U.S., owns the currency used to trade oil? And it's about more than just Iran. Donald Trump can afford to chant America first because, America is first. It's got the dollar, the world's #1 consumer manufacturing market, the internet, not to mention military might, which brings us back to Donald Tusk's rallying cry. What can Europe do? What will Europe do? Today in the France 24 debate, the EU's answer to America first. With us, Hannah Starman, Director of EU Advocacy and Civic Action Group Yes Europe Lab. Thank you for being with us.
Thank you.
Also joining us, Gérald Olivier, columnist for Atlantico.fr, the author of a book on Donald Trump and another one
on Mitt Romney, on Kennedy, and coming up on the U.S. elections.
Coming up on the next U.S.
On the next U.S. election.
Okay.
There'll be one.
He's going to show us his crystal ball on this show. From Warsaw, we'll be joined by Dominik Tarczynski, member of the Polish Parliament for the ruling Law and Justice Party. And from London, we welcome Eli Geranme, Senior Policy Fellow at the European Council on Foreign Relations. Thank you for joining us. The France 24 debate on Facebook and on Twitter, the hashtag F24debate. Let's start with the latest. Danish shipping giant Maersk announcing it was raising anchor and quitting its oil tanker business in Iran. The boss of the company telling the Reuters news agency, with the sanctions the Americans are to impose, you can't do business in Iran if you also have business in the U.S., and we have that on a large scale. German insurer Allianz also announcing plans to wind down its business in Iran. This one day after Total, the French energy giant, announced it might have to pull the plug on its South Pars natural gas project. Wassim Cornet has more.
Total says it will leave Iran rather than face U.S. sanctions. The French oil giant says it would be forced to unwind all operations related to a major gas field project before November unless Washington gives it a special waiver. Total began work on the South Pars project in July 2017, 2 years after Western countries signed a nuclear deal with Iran. The project has been coordinated with China's CNPC and Iran's Petropars. Although Total has a majority stake in the project, so far it has invested less than 40 million euros. The French oil company could be hit hard by U.S. sanctions should it continue to do business in Iran without a U.S. exemption. U.S. banks are involved in 90% of Total's financing. In Bulgaria, for an EU summit, French President Emmanuel Macron said it was important to protect the rights of private companies to do business in Iran.
International companies who have assets in several countries make their own choices, which depend on their own interests. It's essential that that freedom of choice remains.
Total isn't the only company facing an uncertain future in Iran. Companies like Airbus and Peugeot could also be subject to secondary sanctions from Washington because of their trade ties with the U.S. Last Friday, French Economy Minister Bruno Le Maire called on the EU to guarantee European economic sovereignty.
We are waiting for the European Commission to take some very concrete steps to ensure the European sovereignty in economic matters.
Following U.S. threats of reintroducing sanctions on Iran, EU leaders have said they would try to keep their reviving economic cooperation with Tehran.
Yeah, there's supposed to be another informal meeting of EU finance ministers to discuss the response, how to tackle this issue of getting around those sanctions reimposed by the United States. Gérald Olivier, what's going to come of that?
Well, that's really hard to say, because the problem with sanctions is that you're trying to deal on international issues by using economic pressure points on issues which really are not economically related. And so what Trump's vision regarding the Iran deal is one thing, and we may agree, and the more we look at what people are actually saying, the more we see that people seem to agree that the deal was not really that good and should have been somehow revised. But the way to get there is the issue. And unfortunately, by acting the way he did, Trump put a wedge that is going to divide the US and Europe. Because once you put economic issues, and once you put multinational companies in the balance, and once you hinder their business, then you hurt the countries that those companies still kind of belong to or pay taxes to. And in the end, you infuriate them.
All right, so a couple of questions. What are the chances of Total getting that exemption from the US Treasury and being allowed to continue with that South Pars project?
Very low. Very low. Otherwise, the sanctions have no point. Either you have sanctions or you don't.
So what should be the response of France and the EU then?
Well, unfortunately, their response should be to work with Iran towards strengthening the deal. That's actually an incentive. If Trump is acting the way he usually does, he makes a decision which is really as provocative as can be in order to start some form of negotiations. We are right now, even though it's not written down, we are negotiating a new deal. And by putting pressure on all of the players, including the European players who want to stay with the deal, he is telling them, you want to stay, make sure we can lift those sanctions by strengthening the deal first. We're in that kind of a game at the moment. And we have, 190 days total to do it until November 1st, as far as Total is concerned. They say they have to pull out by November or face sanctions.
Hannah Starman, what do you see happening between now and November on that score?
Well, it took 10 years to get to that deal. So if we can modify it until the 1st of November, it would be a miracle. But you're quite right. I mean, it is an incentive. But you said that pulling out of the deal actually puts a wedge between the US and Europe, but it also puts a wedge between within Europe itself, between Eastern Europe, that may be more sensitive to what the United States want, and we saw that very clearly with the transfer of the U.S. embassy to Jerusalem, when the three Eastern European countries.
4 nations represented at that ceremony from Europe. That's
right, and they were all from Eastern Europe. So it's not just the wedge between the United States and Europe. It also threatens the unity of Europe at the very moment when Europe should stick together. On the one hand, if it wants to salvage the deal, if it wants to put pressure on Iran to modify, improve the deal, and on the other hand, if it wants to defend its economic sovereignty, as the French Minister of Economy pointed out.
Yeah, and the other player we've barely mentioned is Iran itself. Donald Trump is convinced that Iran needs the deal more than we do, more than he does, and more than Europe actually does. And Rouhani built his first election and his re-election on the promise of economic growth, of opening the borders, and of somehow reintegrating the international economy. He needs foreign investment. They were hoping on something like $50 billion of investment every year, starting in 2015, thanks to that deal. They haven't gotten that. They were actually pretty disappointed with the pace of economic growth still before the deal. But he's convinced that if they don't get this kind of air, this kind of money infusion, the regime will face social unrest and will be threatened. And that's actually what Trump also is counting on. So the player that is the most motivated to actually doing something should be Iran.
Elie Jeremiah, when you see Maersk quitting its Iran operations, Allianz, Total saying that its project is in jeopardy, is it game over? Trump has won?
Can I just take a moment to remind your viewers and other debaters here that actually China, Russia, the European Union, 28 member states have consistently said this deal is working and it works for the benefit of global security. It was President Trump's choice to walk away from negotiations with the European parties who are actually going quite far extensively to try and cooperate with the United States to build on the nuclear deal. What President Trump wanted the Europeans to do was to violate a nuclear agreement that was enshrined by a UN Security Council resolution. And quite rightly, the Europeans were not accepting that measure, although they did agree, and they came very close to agreeing, to build on that. And it was President Trump's choice to violate the agreement. Now, the position we find ourselves in is, can the Europeans collectively, and together also with China and Russia, work on providing Iran with some, not all, because we can't have it all now, some of the envisaged economic benefits under the deal to keep Iran complying to a very successful implementation, more or less, of a nuclear deal that was far unprecedented when you compare it to other arms controls.
Yeah, and what's the answer
So
when you
this
know,
is the
for
position-
instance, in the past we've had French bank BNP, which got whacked for using U.S. dollars in transactions with Iran?
No, that's sure. And this is actually, my view, a precedent that Europe has wrongly set itself from the past that allows essentially European companies to be subject to US secondary sanctions. Now, back in the day when BNP Paribas was getting these fines hefted, this was under a situation where European Union also had very similar sanctions regimes on Iran. And so politically, we didn't have the divisions that we see right now between the transatlantic allies on this issue. Now we have a different situation. We have a situation where the United States very clearly said we will weaponize our secondary sanctions to make and force Europeans do a U-turn on a foreign policy security issue. And this is why we've seen such an unprecedented degree of the European Union and collaboration between the UK, Germany, and France on keeping this deal in place.
But at the end of the day, we're hearing, again, those companies that are leaving. We had our Moscow correspondent earlier tell us that because Airbus uses so many parts that are made in the United States, Russian manufacturers are stepping in and selling planes to Iran instead. Again, the loser in all of this is also Europe, and it seems to be happening.
No, that's certainly true. And also, Total's partner for that investment in gas exploration in Iran is a Chinese counterpart, which will now scoop the benefits of that investment deal in Iran. And so what we're seeing now is essentially a two-pronged approach from the Europeans. One is, can they try and push through certain specific company and sectoral specific exemptions and waivers with the US administration to allow some of these big strategic deals that we're seeing as essentially the parameters of success of this nuclear agreement to go through. This is going to be very debatable because we have the likes of Mr. John Bolton in the White House now that looks set to make Europeans bear the brunt of these sanctions that he's imposing, that the US is reimposing again. But secondly, there's a second-prong approach where we're seeing the European Union now start work on reviving the blocking regulation and creating the legal and commercial conditions for smaller and medium-sized private entities to be able to deal with Iran. And this was one of the areas where President Macron alluded to today.
I just want to take issue with two things that Ellie said, if I may. Number one, the assumption that the deal was working. I'm not sure everyone agrees on that. And if even at some point it was mentioned that Iran was respecting the letter of the deal, it certainly wasn't respecting the spirit of the deal and the situation in the Middle East, in particular in Yemen, the relationship between the opposition, the conflict, the coming conflict between Iran and Saudi Arabia was proof that certainly on most issues, the deal was not working, because the idea, really what Obama had in mind, was to lower the Iranian threat. And he wasn't looking at a general type of war, but rather helping Israel. The very start was to get Iran off Israel's back so we could work out a deal in the Middle East. That didn't work out at all. And so to assume that the deal was working is not necessarily true and definitely not agreed upon. Second point, about sanctions. Unfortunately, what's happening here is not unprecedented at all. Every time we hit a country, and when I say we, Europe, the US, the UN, when we decide to put sanctions on a country for whatever reason, was the case on Russia after Ukraine and Crimea, we hurt our businesses. and we consider that's the price to pay for a better situation or to get our deal through. The problem here is that the we is no longer united, and like I said, it drove a wedge between the US and Europe.
Ellie Geranmaye?
Yeah, so there's only one body that's in charge of telling the world whether the nuclear deal is working or not. That is the IAEA. And the Europeans and all the other countries that are parties to the deal have agreed that there is one body that's in charge. It has reported over 11 times that the deal is being implemented by Iran on the technical level. When you ask any European party to this deal, they will tell you that the deal was about one issue and one issue only, Iran's nuclear program, and creating unparalleled, unprecedented monitoring mechanisms over that, which we have now. Hence why the Europeans are taking such efforts to keep this deal in place. But there's a second issue now at play. When we have President Trump essentially threatening trade war with Europe through aluminium and steel tariffs that are graciously being extended 1 month at a time at the moment, in addition to a clear signal to say that the US will weaponize its sanctions policy against its closest allies, we have a real problem here. And I think that's what Donald Tusk was implying to. And this is an unprecedented situation because in the past, the European Union has broadly mirrored US sanctions policy. So we've never had to deal with this division and these differences before till we have today.
Yeah, that brings us to the other big issue at that EU summit in Bulgaria, a summit that was supposed to be about expansion to the Western Balkans, but it's been overshadowed by the standoff with Washington. Hannah Starman, the European Union saying it's willing to open its market to more U.S. imports, including cars, but only once Donald Trump lifts the threat of steel and aluminum tariffs. So it's a bit what Gérald Olivier says. Trump takes this extreme position, and there is a bit of bending to get him to agree to something. Of course, the U.S. is saying first you have to lift that threat of sanctions.
Well, that's what the European Union is saying, right?
Yeah.
Yeah. No, of course. This is his style. This is his deal-making style, and we can think whatever we want with it. Whether it's successful or not, we're yet to see. But certainly, I think what's going on now, it's really an opportunity that Europe should use. It's a challenge, obviously, because we're faced with an unprecedented situation, but it's also an opportunity. I mean, what Donald Tusk is basically saying is, right, okay, we're on our own, so we have to stick together and we have to fight. All right,
an opportunity when it comes to tariffs. I want to ask you about that because that is so important, but we have to take a very quick break. Stay with us. You're watching the France 24 debate.
What do you want from your news website? France24.com, giving you easier access to information and faster for a unique experience. France24.com, the international news website.
Join France 24 on the red carpet in Cannes.
Down to Earth, presented by Florence Villeminot.
The Arctic is going to be exploited, and the scale of this exploitation will only grow.
We have a beautiful planet, we need to protect it, and we can use space exploration to better understand it.
Now we've moved from is that real to what do we do about it?
Join us on Down to Earth, where we explore the incredibly complex relationship between humans and our planet. We're here to ask the tough questions and find answers that may just surprise you.
Down to Earth on France 24 and France24.com.
Welcome back. You're watching France 24. Before we get back to the debate, some of the stories we're following for you in the newsroom. The latest outbreak of Ebola reaches a major city in northwest Congo. One case confirmed in Mbandaka. The patient estimated to have been in contact with more than 300 people. Italian populists closer to an unprecedented coalition. The anti-establishment Five-Star Movement and the far-right Liga agree on a platform that flies in the face of EU rules on public spending. The European Union willing to open its market to more U.S. imports, including cars, but only once Donald Trump lifts the threat of steel and aluminum tariffs. And with the trade row heating up between Brussels and Washington, the EU, the US, and China launch a second round of trade talks to defuse their brewing trade war. Delano D'Souza will have all the day's business. Welcome back, or welcome if you're just joining us. It's the France 24 debate, and we're looking at the war of the Donalds, the war of words. Donald Trump and Donald Tusk, the president of the European Council, who has said with friends like Donald Trump, who needs enemies, this over the Iran deal and what we were talking about just before the break, which is trade. Those EU leaders meeting in Sofia, Bulgaria, and there they've said that they first want the lifting of new import duties of 25% on steel, 10% on aluminum for Europe. It's been temporarily waived until June the 1st. They want it to be permanent. Among the reactions we've been getting on the hashtag F24 debate, one from Daniel: it's time for the EU to act like the superstate it is. The EU is a model of how countries can cooperate to provide progressive, peaceful, social, and democratic environment for its citizens. The EU needs to start developing its own army and foreign policy. Well, that's the thought of one viewer. But before we get that far ahead, what we were talking about just before the break, which is what it does in response to those threat of tariffs by the United States. Elie Jeremiah, just read to you here what the German economy minister, Peter Altmaier, has said, that finding a common stance when it comes to the response to Donald Trump's tariff threat between Germany and France first has to be ironed out before you can offer something to the United States. He says coming to a common deal with France is proving equally difficult as with the United States, remarks he made a short while back. Your thoughts on that?
Well, I think certainly the powerhouses of the European Union economy need to first unify behind a collective position. Only in that way can they actually have a strong hand. When you consider that the combined GDP of the European Union is roughly on par with the United States. But if each country has its own policies on these issues, it's going to be very hard to actually get the best position for the entire member states in the European Union. So it's certainly important for France and Germany to come to some sort of an agreement on this issue going forward.
It's a seminal moment, Gérald Olivier, for the EU, with Donald Trump throwing down the gauntlet. Mm-hmm. There are those like the outgoing deputy head of the European Central Bank saying, look, it's time, it's now or never if we want things like a banking union. Yeah, but haven't we heard this before, this idea that we were going to have really an independent Europe? The basic contradiction has to do with finances. It also has to do with defense. It's kind of ironic that it should be Donald Tusk who is talking the way he does about Donald Trump and the United States, considering how heavily Poland relies on American weaponry for its defense, even though it's a European country. Right, Donald Tusk, the former prime minister of Poland. Absolutely. When Poland signed a deal for 10 billions of F-16s instead of the French Rafale, so maybe he wasn't very European at that time. Of course, the U.S. is a NATO country, and that's the contradiction. European countries are members of NATO. NATO is a defensive union built around the United States. And the EU is also an economic and political bloc that has some autonomy. But if you don't have the autonomy to ensure your own security, you're not really independent. And that's the whole problem that Europe has to face. And until Europeans are willing to put in the effort and the money it will take to build their own Europe, they will have a hard time talking on equal terms, even on economic issues facing the US. Well, let's go to Sofia, where that that summit's been taking place. Polish journalist and commentator Dominik Kosic is there. Thank you for being with us here in the France 24 debate. What do you think of the EU response to Donald Trump's threat of trade sanctions?
Hello. I think that all EU leaders are very upset with this response of Donald Trump, but apparently Donald Tusk is one of the leaders who wants to be very popular, and I don't found in this speech, this short comment of Donald Tusk, and a deep thought. He wanted just to be this smart guy from European Union who is very liked by all EU members. So I think that Donald Tusk doesn't think that the US is a big enemy for EU. He just wanted to be this smart guy, and I think that it was maybe also small personal revenge, because last year when Donald Trump was visiting European Union, was visiting Brussels, he met of course Donald Tusk, and he told that one Donald is enough. It was a joke of Jean-Claude Juncker. Trump was very happy, so I think that it was also small personal revenge of Donald Tusk.
So Dominika Kosic, how do you suggest the EU respond to this threat of tariffs, to Trump walking away from the Iran deal?
I think that we all need time to rethink this, because Europe needs US, it is for sure, not only in the context of NATO, in the frame of NATO, but also to other deals with Syria, with other neighbors, with Russia, for example. So I think that after a few days, when some decision will be taken, maybe it will be a new message from European Union, because I think that it is mutual interest, mutual business, in good relation between Washington and Brussels. So I hope that it will be established in a better way.
Hannah Starman, you agree that the EU needs to take time to think? Or is...
I certainly think that we need to continue talking to everybody, and that we need allies, and that, Russia, as much as the United States, should, are historical allies and should be kept as such as much as possible. But I also think that this is a wake-up call for Europe, that, it's very possible that, we will not be able to count on our allies in the future as we have been in the past, and that there is, the time has come when Europe has to pull itself together and actually become as sovereign as it should be. I mean, we have a huge deficit when it comes to digital giants, for example. I mean, in comparison to the United States or to China, we're really lagging behind. This is certainly something that we should work on. Unity is obviously a problem in Europe, because we are 28, soon 27 countries, some of which are heavily dependent on the United States or on Russia. So it's difficult, but it has to be done.
Building the defense, building the answer to the fact that the Americans own the major internet giants. Mm-hmm. Next week there'll be Mark Zuckerberg, by the way.
I know.
Who will be coming
to the European Parliament.
To the European Parliament.
Behind closed doors. He's not going
Donald
to
Trump
repeat the exercise.
Making us more than aware that the world's currency is not the euro, but the US dollar. The projects, the goals you're talking about, they're all long-term stuff. What happens in the short run?
Well, in the short run, we need to keep talking, right? We need to make sure that those tariffs are not imposed. That we need to secure exemptions. Of course, we need to do what we can to protect our industry, to protect our economy. But I think we also need simultaneously to work on achieving this sovereignty that the French president, but not only, has been talking about, and that Europe urgently needs. But it will only be doable once we have the basic tenets of a sovereign entity. Of a sovereign entity.
In his radio show, UKIP's former leader, Nigel Farage's advice to Tusk, quote, rather than give this big whinge against the US president, you want to look a little closer to home, matey. Farage then letting loose with a long tirade about the populist coalition that's in the work in Italy, with a government platform that includes flat taxes, big welfare increases, basic universal income, all this flouting Eurozone directives on reining in public debt. The deal would be between the anti-establishment Five Star Movement and the far-right Liga.
We've seen the Financial Times have written, Rome opens its gates to the modern barbarians. The barbarians are arriving in Rome. Better to be a barbarian than a slave. Better to be a barbarian than a slave that sells Italy's dignity, future, business, and even its borders.
Eli Gerardmaye, with what's coming up around the corner in Italy, EU unity looks like a heavy lift when you're trying to confront the United States.
No, and certainly this is going to be one of the biggest challenges. The internal issues of Europe have essentially distracted us from being a relevant foreign policy actor on a number of big global security issues. And so this, what we're seeing in Italy, but not just Italy, other countries in the Union that seem to have very different, at least to what was originally envisaged for the European Union, ideas about the values-based system will continue to challenge the ability of Europe to play its hand strongly. And add to that, of course, the looming Brexit negotiations that will continue, I think, to distract Europeans from foreign policy issues. But I would say, having said that, the issue, going back to your original point on the nuclear deal with Iran, has been one area where Britain, France, and Germany, despite all of these issues and problems facing the Union, including the Brexit negotiations which are happening in parallel, have managed to act together in a very unprecedented, unified way to hold a clear line in terms of saying that Europe will continue to implement an international obligation that it sees as working.
Gérald Olivier?
Yeah, earlier you mentioned that, this is a seminal moment. And it's true, but I think it is in more than one sense. What we're witnessing in Europe is a total recomposition of the political landscape. Macron did it last year by winning the election, coming almost from nowhere. The UK coming out of the EU and the rise of the populist nationalist even within that country also upended the political system. In some way, Trump's victory in the US and the rise of Bernie Sanders were a total recomposition of that landscape. We're now witnessing the same thing in Italy, and I'm not sure it's finished, and I think it can go on throughout other countries. It's going to be very difficult for Europe at the moment because it has to work on that unity at the same time as it has to work on who is actually representative of whom. And what we're seeing through those different elections with results that we definitely don't expect is that the people at the bottom feel that their voice hasn't been heard, and they're trying to make sure that it's going to be in the future, and that's inevitably is going to lead sometimes not of chaos, but definitely of having a difficult time talking to each other, fighting what's the right road and going the right way. But if Europe has to do one thing, it is to listen a little more to its people at the bottom and a little less to its technocrats on top.
Dominika Kosic, which is the biggest threat at this point for the EU? Which undermines it more? The positions of the United States or those of Russia? I ask the question about Russia because inside that platform of what could be the new coalition in Italy, therefore the lifting of sanctions against Russia.
Yes, that's a very big problem because this new coalition in Italy can be kind of friend of Russia because, as we know, Five Stars movement is supporting Russian politicians. They have close connection with Russia. And from the other side, you have also some other Western countries who are close to Russia, who didn't, for example, withdraw the diplomats from Russia, like Austria, maybe not Germany, because Germany is quite reasonable in the case of Russia. But you have example of Bulgaria, you have an example of Austria. There are some countries who are supporting close relation with Russia, and they can be against new sanction and against even continuation of this sanction, which has been done already on Russia. So it is a problem also for Poland and Baltic states, because for us, as you know, Russia is considering as a kind of country who is not only neighbors, but the source of potential threat. And as history has showed many times, Russia is real.
So which right now, at this point in time, Dominika, at this point in time, which right now undermines more, the EU speaking with a strong voice, the United States or Russia?
It's a very difficult question, honestly talking. I hope that they will speak more common voice towards Russia, because in the case of United States, there are countries who are supporting the United States. Of course, for example, Poland, who used to be this Eastern European alliance of the United States, but in this case, in this particular case, Poland is supporting Brussels, of course, and it is showing solidarity with Brussels and institutions and other countries. So I can't answer you on this question because both examples are difficult, Russia and United States, and I think that in Brussels it will be lots of problems, and it is one of the problems to solve, and it will be very difficult to answer on which way we should go, and we will go.
Elijah Ranmaye?
Well, I think that certainly seen from the view of a number of capitals in Europe, Russia is seen as a strategic threat, whereas the United States, I think, is seen as a strategic challenge, dealing with an ally who essentially no longer considers Europe relevant in decision-making on certain very important global security issues and trade issues directly. So I think that, it's the threat versus the challenge, and perhaps the threat is very internal to European unity itself, coming from Russia. But I think that what we're seeing from the United States is a real challenge, which the Europeans perhaps haven't quite woken up to, which is the rules of the game in the Western alliance that we've had for so long are changing. They're being constantly changed over the past year and a half by one man, and he's sitting in the White House. And I think that there is this sense in many capitals that they can see this time through, that they will wait for the next US president to come. But I think that the damage that we've seen so far could exasperate. And until I agree with others on this call, on this debate, that until that Europe really has some sense of more independent security and defense policy, it will be very difficult for it to grapple with the challenges and these new world orders that are being set by both the United States, but also Russia and China.
And yet, Hannah Starman, we see Germany where the percentage of GDP devoted to defense is going down.
I would just like to return to your previous question for a second, because I think it's interesting. You asked the question is if there were no connection between the two, between the election of Trump and Russia's activities. I mean, you could safely say that Russia can just sit back and watch. That its part in what's going on now has been done before.
Its meddling in the U.S. election points to what?
Well, I mean, as far as we know, and as far as we're likely to find out, Russia did support the election of Donald Trump. Now, to which degree and by which means, we'll have to see. But I think the investigation will show that. But I don't think that the two countries right now are at the opposing ends of the scale.
A final word on this. Gérald Olivier, is the EU then sort of under threat from both sides here?
I think the EU has to take issues one at a time and not to lump everything together, because we actually are dealing with several issues. The trade issue is one thing. The Iran deal is another. Relationship with Russia is a third, and relationship between the US and Russia with the EU in the middle is a fourth. We are in the middle of trade negotiations regarding steel tariffs and other things, and the Europeans should keep talking to the Americans about it and considering that those different threats are actually part of the negotiation, and extending the waivers a month at a time until we reach a deal is the right thing to do. Regarding Iran, I think there was a major mistake made by the Europeans. They did not believe Trump would actually act on his promise. Because we've known from the start, we've known since the campaign that he said the US would withdraw from that deal. And for the past year, Europeans have tried to change his mind on the issue instead of getting ahead of the deal and say, okay, what comes next? What should we do so that we stay together and we work towards a better end for all of us, since security is also an issue.
Is that a dig at Emmanuel Macron, who went to
He's not the only one to have gone. He's not the only one to have gone. It's not just Macron himself, but Boris Johnson went there, Angela Merkel was there. If you read some of the papers that came out of Brussels a year ago, people were telling what Europeans should do was have a plan for when the US withdraw, because they knew that it was going to happen, and apparently nobody actually worked on that plan. Now, the other issue is internal reform for Europe. The third, indeed, is relationship with Russia, and maybe at some point come to an understanding that we are no longer in a Cold War and we have common interests and we should work on those. So let's take things one at a time and put them back in order. When I got here, you said never a dull day. It's true, never a dull day. Everything is happening at the same time. But if we take things one at a time, I'm sure Europeans can sort them out.
Yeah, we quipped about how Europe once used to be boring for journalists. No longer the case. Gérald Olivier, I want to thank you. I want to thank Hannah Starman. I want to thank as well Elijah and Maye for being with us from London, and Dominika Kosic for being with us from Sofia, Bulgaria, where that EU summit's been taking place. Stay with us. Media Watch is next. All right, we've been having the European look, of course. We're based in Paris. Hello, Emma James.
Hi there.
What do they think about all this, the other side of the Atlantic?
Well, you've caught me out because I'm starting in Germany.
Oh, okay.
So sorry to spoil your plan.
All right.
But yes, Der Spiegel has a particularly arresting front page this week, its current edition, which we can't seem to see at the moment. But basically it has a finger held aloft, shall we say, by a very orange hand, and it's very recognisably...
There you go.
Donald Trump, there we go. And he's saying, goodbye,
That's
Europe.
Rude.
It is rather rude, a little bit unexpected, perhaps, but there we go. Hope you're not too offended by that. But it really does sum up, I think, how people feel Donald Trump is approaching the EU. He has very little regard for Europe. Now, inside this magazine, Der Spiegel invites readers to join the anti-Trump resistance, and they talk about how it's impossible to overstate what Donald Trump has dismantled in the last 16 months. They talk about Europe has lost its protective power, it's lost its guarantor of joint values, which all sounds very grand. They also say it's lost the global political influence that it was only able to exert because the US stood by its side. So Der Spiegel really painting Europe as very much the weak little underling compared to the US. It is rather a reflection, too, of Angela Merkel's view that Europe can no longer rely on the United States. Now, looking elsewhere, The Economist, Peter Schrank has come up with this cartoon for The Economist, which has the EU versus Uncle Sam, boring little man holding an EU briefcase, versus the might of Uncle Sam, very much a David and Goliath kind of a battle. Now, the article that accompanies this is a very interesting one. As it says here, Europe has few good options for dealing with Donald Trump, and it does seem that the one thing everyone can agree on is that they're not sure how this should go forward from here. Now, this article actually likens the current situation to the plot of Love Actually. I don't know if you've seen the movie. Hugh Grant plays the sort of bumbling British Prime Minister who finally stands up to the bullying, unpleasant US president. So plenty of parallels there, clearly, according to this writer. But they say that standing up to Donald Trump would be an approach that, well, it's not without risk. Standing up to Trump feels intoxicating, but Europe's options are limited by its own divisions and dependence. And they talk in particular about the fact that 3 countries just last week vetoed an EU statement condemning the US embassy move to Jerusalem. And, of course, there is that feeling that can the EU, containing so many countries, actually reach agreement and come together and formulate the right plan to tackle one country alone? Now, Foreign Affairs has been looking at this one too. All plaudits to the photo editor who came up with this image. Angela Merkel.
McDougall from Reuters took that picture.
Absolutely. Angela Merkel looking very, very downcast there alongside Emmanuel Macron. You'll notice how often the UK is being cut out of images and headlines all the time on this one. And really unsurprising, it has to be said, given the current situation. Why Trump can safely ignore Europe is the title of this article. Its leaders readily condemn but never act, apparently. And it talks about, we all know that the European leaders are angry, but will they actually do anything? Trump basically, they feel, wields too much power for Angela Merkel even to do anything about it. Emmanuel Macron, supposedly the new BFF of Donald Trump, went out to Washington to do a bit of Trump whispering. It clearly fell on deaf ears. And so no real traction gained there. And of course, the UK, with the spectre of Brexit hanging over it, that sort of dawn coming ever closer on the horizon, it really isn't in a position to upset any of its supposed friends.
All right, so that's what's coming up, and we'll be talking about it, by the way, more in the world this week. On Friday, Donald Trump upsetting the order, not just in Europe, but in the Middle East as well. Emma James, I want to thank you. I want to thank our panel. Thank you for joining us here in the France 24 debate.